I want to tell you exactly what happened when I replaced Windows with Linux for 30 days, because this was not some casual experiment or a weekend challenge. This was my main computer, my daily workflow, my files, my habits, my frustrations, and my expectations all thrown into one big real-world test. I genuinely thought I knew what I was getting into. I've used Windows my whole life. I've heard people hype Linux for years. I've watched videos, read comments, and listened to arguments on both sides. I expected some rough edges, a learning curve, maybe a few compatibility problems. What I wasn't ready for was how deeply this change would mess with my assumptions about computers, productivity, control, and even what normal computing is supposed to feel like. Day one started with confidence. I backed up my files, made a bootable USB, and wiped Windows without no safety net. I wanted the full experience. As the Linux installer ran, I felt that mix of excitement and anxiety you only get when you know you can't undo something easily. The installation finished faster than any Windows setup I've ever seen. No account creation circus, no forced sign-ins, no just-a-moment screens dragging on forever. When the desktop loaded, it was clean, fast, and quiet. No pop-ups, no system nags, no notifications begging me to finish setup. For the first time in years, my computer felt like it belonged to me again. That feeling alone almost convinced me I'd made the right choice. Then, reality slowly started to kick in. The first few hours were actually amazing. Everything felt fast. My laptop booted in seconds. Apps opened instantly, and the system barely used any RAM at idle. I started opening things just to see how responsive it was. File manager, browser, settings, terminal, it all felt snappy, like my hardware had suddenly been upgraded. I kept checking system honors because it didn't feel real. On Windows, my machine always felt like it was busy doing something in the background. On Linux, it felt calm, almost polite. That calmness was addictive. But then came the first wall. Software needed my usual tools, and this is where the honeymoon phase started cracking. Some apps were there, instantly open source alternatives that installed with a single command or click. Others weren't at all. No installer, no official Linux version, no simple workaround. At first, I brushed it off. I'll find an alternative, I told myself. And I did, but alternatives are not always replaced. They work differently, look different, and sometimes force you to change workflows you've built over years. That was the first lesson Linux taught me. Freedom comes with responsibility, and responsibility means adaptation. By the end of the first week, frustration had officially entered the room. Simple things I never thought about on Windows suddenly required research. Why doesn't this app see my device? Why won't this file open the way I expect? Why does this setting live here instead of there? Linux didn't hold my hand, and at times it felt like it didn't care if I figured things out or not. Forums became my second home. I learned quickly that Linux users don't just use their systems. They understand them. Commands weren't magic spells. They were explanations. Once I realized that, something shifted in my mindset. One of the biggest surprises was how much control I suddenly had on Windows. Updates happen when Microsoft decides. On Linux's, updates happened when I wanted. No forced restarts. No updating your system screens at the worst possible time. I could update everything with one command, or ignore updates entirely if I chose. That level of control felt almost dangerous at first, like being handed the keys to something powerful without a manual. But as the days passed, that control became empowering instead of intimidating. Gaming was another shock. I expected it to be bad, really bad. Instead, it was complicated. Some games ran flawlessly, even better than they did on Windows. Others refused to work, no matter what I tried. Tweaking settings, installing compatibility layers, reading long guides, experimenting with versions. When it worked, it felt like magic. When it didn't, it was infuriating. Linux gaming isn't impossible anymore, but it's not effortless either. That gap between possible and easy is where most of the pain lives. Around day 10, something unexpected happened. I stopped missing Windows, not completely, but enough that I noticed it. My muscle memory started adapting. Keyboard shortcuts changed, file locations made sense, and the terminal stopped feeling scary. I started solving problems instead of fighting the system. Linux wasn't trying to be Windows, and once I stopped expecting it to be, things improved dramatically. That was a huge mental shift. Linux doesn't want to mimic Windows. It wants to be Linux, and it does that unapologetically. Performance continued to impress me. Even after installing everything I needed, the system stayed fast and responsive. No slowdowns over time, no mysterious lag creeping in. I realized how much I had normalized sluggish behavior on Windows. Little palsies, random stutters, unexplained CPU spikes. On Linux, performance was consistent, predictable. That consistency made me trust my system in a way I hadn't trusted Windows in years. But Linux also tested my patience in new ways. Hardware support was mostly great, but when something didn't work, it really didn't work. There was no download driver button, no automatic fix. Sometimes the answer was buried in a forum post from 5 years ago written by someone who assumed you already knew what they were talking about. I had moments where I seriously considered reinstalling Windows just to make one thing work. Those moments were humbling. Privacy was another area where Linux quietly won me over. No ads in the operating system, no tracking tied to my user account, no feeling that my system was reporting back to some corporate server. That absence was powerful. It made me realize how much noise Windows creates, how many small intrusions I'd learned to ignore. Linux felt silent in comparison, and that silence gave me peace of mind I didn't expect. By the halfway point, Linux started feeling normal. And that's when I realized how deeply Windows had shaped my expectations. Things I once thought were essential turned out to be habits, not necessities. The start menu, the control panel chaos, the registry, the endless background services. Linux stripped computing down to essentials and then let me build upward if I wanted. That modularity was both liberating and overwhelming. The community aspect was something I wasn't prepared for either. Linux users are passionate, sometimes aggressively so, but also incredibly helpful. When I asked questions, people didn't just give answers. They explained why things worked the way they did. That educational aspect made me a better computer user overall. I wasn't just fixing problems. I was learning systems thinking. Windows never taught me that. Windows just worked until it didn't, and then it blamed something else. Around day 20, productivity hit a new high. My workflow was cleaner, my system was lighter, and distractions were minimal. I wasn't fighting pop-ups, notifications, or forced changes. Linux stayed out of my way. It let me focus. That was perhaps the most unexpected outcome of this experiment. I thought Linux would slow me down. Instead, it removed friction I didn't even realize was there. But let me be honest, Linux is not for everyone. There were still moments where I missed Windows deeply. Certain software, certain games, certain conveniences. Linux asks you to care, to think, to engage. If you just want things to work exactly the way they always have, Linux will frustrate you. It demands curiosity and patience. Without those, the experience can be miserable. As day 30 approached, I had to make a decision. Go back to Windows or stay on Linux. That decision wasn't easy, and that alone shocked me. I expected this to be a temporary experiment. Instead, it became a re-evaluation of my relationship with technology. Windows is familiar, polished, and widely supported, but it's also restrictive, noisy, and increasingly controlled by corporate priorities. Linux is raw, flexible, and honest, but it asks more from you in return. In the end, I wasn't ready for how much Linux would change the way I think about computers. It didn't just replace Windows. It challenged the idea that one company should define how we use our machines. It reminded me that computing can be personal again, customizable, and transparent. The biggest surprise wasn't the bugs, the learning curve, or the missing apps. The biggest surprise was realizing that for the first time in years, my computer felt like a tool instead of a product. Replacing Windows with Linux for 30 days didn't make Linux perfect, but it made Windows feel heavier in hindsight. And once you feel that difference, it's very hard to unfeel it.